I was thinking about something. Yes, I know, as a millennial, I tend to overthink things, but just hear me out. There's been a resurgence of retro-style motorcycle design. Have you felt it, as I have? Just look around you. We live in a world where you could buy brand new bikes like the XSR700 and 900, which are both literally just retro-style reskins of pre-existing bikes.
Yamaha XSR700. The short and sweet of it, take an FZ09, put some neo-retro styling on it, give it some better suspension, add traction control, you got a new motorcycle.
The BMW R nineT series of bikes, which include standard, scrambler, and true cafe racer style packages that all evoke a feeling of the past.
Everyone loves a cafe racer, don't they? And this is BMW's cafe racer, the BMW R9T Racer.
Ducati has a Scrambler line of bikes, which include both a Scrambler and also a Cafe Racer, which they oddly named Scrambler Cafe Racer, which are two different custom style motorcycles altogether, but we'll let them pass because this thing looks so good.
To make it a Cafe Racer, they've put 17-inch wheels on the bike, they've given it all the nice little Cafe Racer tweaks, clip-ons, short mud guard, and a styling update really.
They also have the even sexier Ducati Sport Classic line, which looks absolutely incredible as the most faithfully old style bike yet. Triumph has remained true to the segment with the Bonneville line of bikes, which have been running strong since they brought them back in 2001. And the new Bonneville Bobber looks incredible if you ask me.
In the 1940s, the Bobber look came out after GIs came back from the war in America, for World War II to America, and they basically took the bikes of the time and they cut them apart.
Hell, their new Scrambler option is old school done right with those big chrome pipes mounted way up high. And who could forget about those newly revealed options from both Suzuki and Honda? The Big Red Wing Company have more or less just completed their retro style motorcycle lineup, starting with that gorgeous CB1000R, which shakes the Japanese naked bike box, and then they introduced a beginner bike of the same style with the CB300R, and now they have introduced the CB650R to fill out the middleweight segment. Suzuki pleasantly surprised the world by introducing the super faithful revival of the original 1981 Suzuki Katana. I mean, really, just look at this instantly recognizable silhouette. It basically looks like how you remember the original Katana to look.
The Katana's having a little bit of a kind of renaissance at the moment because of the kind of the classic racing and the modern classic scenes becoming so popular.
I could go on listing these bikes, and I'm sure that there's bikes that some of y'all will punch me for not mentioning, but I kind of want to talk about why such a trend has risen to prominence and sort of offer my thoughts on the whole thing. And it's easy to think about such a thing when you spend quite so much time interacting with your own vintage bike or looking up ways you can enhance it when you're not interacting with it. Many times in my life I've been labeled a hipster for my different styles and also my taste for things of old, which sort of oversimplifies the definition of hipster, considering otherwise I do not fit in that category in the slightest. But I will absolutely cop to my love for the things of the past, as they represent a world that I will never actually experience. The closest you can get to that is to experience the relics left behind from each era. You can overcome circumstance, but you cannot overcome time. Old school things tend to also evoke a feeling of accessibility, simplicity, and robustness, lending themselves to a minimalistic and hands-on mindset, which are three characteristics slowly being ripped from the vehicles rolling off of the assembly lines these days. And that's for better or worse, depending on who you ask. But time once again is relentless, and these relics of old are still subject to decay and deterioration that leave them ironically requiring more upkeep than the aforementioned non-simple vehicles of new. It's almost paradoxical, isn't it? On top of that, despite the much greater accessibility when it comes to working on older bikes, some people just do not want to potentially wrench on a bike anyway, which I understand, but I don't agree. But I understand. A big rule of design is that trends pretty much always make a comeback because whatever elements that comprise the trend will exceed the old but not old enough to be cool phase, eventually reaching an age that allows it to speak to someone's nostalgia who experienced it. A nostalgia that will oftentimes shield their eyes to how good it actually was in reality, being held in high enough regard that people who aren't even of age begin to borrow nostalgia with no ability to anecdotally counter said high regards. Motorcycles such as the CB650R or the Bonneville or all the rest speak to those in either category. Quite simply, therein lies the need for neo-retro bikes. They appeal to people like me who appreciate the old, but they also appeal to people who appreciate the look of an older bike, but not necessarily the experience of one, which can be quite a headache at times. In the almost 4 years that I've been riding bikes, I have truly noticed that my taste in bikes grew. Not necessarily grew in the sense that it matured, but it expanded. Before I was even on two wheels, my dream bike was a 2004 Ninja ZXXR636, and the first bike that I wanted was a super sporty looking Ninja 250 of late. You know, that way I could ride safe as a scrub, but also look like I was on a much sportier bike than I actually was, because I was just so into sport bikes. You couldn't really get me to look at anything that wasn't a sport bike. But what I ended up on was a rather ratty 1986 Honda Rebel that I had to learn the ins and outs of by wrenching on, and very quickly I'd found myself taking initiative by not only correcting issues, but also doing jobs of preventative maintenance. The byproduct of constantly wrenching on a bike is eventually you end up forging it into something that reflects your own style. And for a bike that I thought was so ratty and rough, to my surprise, it certainly got plenty of positive attention from people out in the wild, which introduced me to the idea that sometimes it's all about the character of the bike and not necessarily how shiny and nice it might look. Looking back, I'm honestly glad that I picked up that old Rebel because it fostered my ability to turn wrenches. Really, the Rebel is to blame for creating my interest in older bikes because it taught me that sometimes depending on your use case and your commitment, simple might be better. It also created my interest in custom bikes because of, well, how much time I spent customizing it. So here I am staring at this vintage BMW that I'm ripping apart and proudly realizing that not only has it given me a productive way to spend my time, but it has also made me smarter through experience. And that's something that manufacturers cannot sell. It is something that cannot be bought. The only way to acquire experience is to strike a deal with time. Do it or don't. Time won't wait up for you. And I'd like to stress that I'm not ripping on folks who buy retro-style bikes with a custom look instead of creating their own. In fact, I honestly celebrate that, which is exactly why I would love to own any of the neo-retro style bikes that I mentioned earlier in this video. Hell, I was about an hour too late from owning the 2006 Speed Triple instead of the FZ1 that you guys know. But the thing is, when I reached the dealership, it was actually already sold. The funny thing is that while shopping for an alternative that ultimately ended up being the FZ1, I could see the Speed Triple sitting in the corner staring at me with its big old bug eyes because it was purchased, but the owner just didn't take delivery yet. Quite frankly, the retro-inspired Street Fighter looks of the Triple still appeal to me more than even my FZ1, but don't tell anyone I said that. Despite having the inclination for building a bike, I would also just as easily go out and buy one of these retro style bikes because they're pretty much custom bikes that can be reliably dailied. Not that you can't daily a custom or an old bike, but with no warranty, no one's going to be there to hold your hand if something breaks down, which, unless you're riding an absolutely 100% restored down to the little rubber bushings example of an old bike, something probably will break down. See, with a neo retro bike, you're getting a brand new bike complete with warranties, parts availabilities, quality assurance, and a history that ultimately begins with you, so no discovering any hack jobs or, weird stuff or anything like that. And given that 4 out of my 5 bikes have been from Craigslist, that's definitely an appealing concept. As someone who was raised in the hood, my experience with motorcycles as a kid had always largely been limited to sport bikes and maybe some dirt bikes. But I had lived next to this dealership and a few well-known bikers around the hood. In the same way that predominantly white areas in the suburbs or rural areas tend to have gangs or clubs that ride mainly cruisers or even specifically Harleys, in the hood, organized clubs and gangs, they typically ride sport bikes. I mean, haven't you seen biker boys? But now that I'm actually on 2 wheels and paying more attention as well as networking with bikers from all over this diverse city, I've actually found that the retro scene, be it neo-retro, stock older bikes, or custom older bikes, is actually quite huge here. And because the real older bikes require more work, attention, love, and collaboration, these tend to be the folks who spend the most time breaking a mold and networking to create and maintain them, along with the overall creativity required to build a bike or to even have interest in them. But unfortunately, what was once a cheap alternative to a new bike has now become an overpriced bubbly market, and you're better off importing vintage bikes from other states in many cases. But quite frankly, that's a whole nother topic, and it's really just a sucky byproduct of an otherwise awesome thing. I found myself drawn to the vintage custom bike world because I've always been drawn to creating literally anything. But I understand that the wrenching part isn't everyone's thing when it comes to bikes, and neo-retro bikes give people a less stressful and involved entry into this world by offering them a classic look that everyone seems to be going for now with the reliability of a new bike. So as long as they can accept the deficit in respect for something that was built from the ground up, then they really have everything that they need right there. Some companies have been in the retro-inspired market longer than others, stressing the concept of heritage, but everyone is jumping on the wave now. Much in the same way that the American muscle car market is capturing the soul of the 1960s and 70s, motorcycle corporations are capitalizing on this increasing interest in old school bikes and the wave of nostalgia permeating society. And if you ask me, God bless them for it. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend.